There's a strange kind of man who makes people uneasy. He isn't loud. He doesn't rebel for attention. He simply doesn't need what everyone else chases. He's content in his solitude, unbothered by the usual promises of romance, validation, or belonging. And that quiet independence terrifies society, because society, for all its talk of freedom, depends on need. It survives by convincing us that happiness lies outside ourselves, tied to approval, partnership, success, marriage. To step outside that circle, to need nothing from it, is to question its entire foundation. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this clearly, and thus spoke Zarathustra. He wrote of the last man, the comfortable conformist, who avoids all pain, all risk, all greatness. Against him stands the Übermensch, the one who creates his own values, who walks alone through the wilderness of meaning. The man who doesn't need marriage isn't necessarily rejecting love. He's rejecting dependency, the idea that his worth, identity, or completion depend on another person or on social approval. But here's the paradox. Society celebrates independence only up to the point where it doesn't threaten its norms. We praise the self-made man, but fear the self-contained one. We admire confidence, but distrust those who can't be controlled by desire or shame. In this video, we'll explore why Nietzsche's vision of radical self-sufficiency challenges one of society's most sacred institutions, marriage, and why that challenge is not just social, but spiritual. Through 6 core insights, we still uncover what society fears about the man who stands alone, how dependence shapes morality and desire, and what it truly means to live as Nietzsche sips, sovereign individual. This isn't a rejection of love or connection. It's a call to understand the deeper psychology of freedom. Because the man who doesn't need marriage may, paradoxically, be the only one capable of truly loving. There's a strange tension in how society views independence. We glorify it in stories, the lone hero, the maverick, the self-made individual. But when we meet someone who truly embodies it, someone who doesn't need approval, affection, or structure, we grow uneasy. His calm threatens us. His detachment feels dangerous, because beneath all our admiration for freedom lies a hidden truth. Most of what we call independence is still dependence in disguise. We admire the man who builds his own life, so long as it still looks familiar. A house, a partner, a respectable profession. But when a man steps outside those symbols entirely, when he no longer seeks validation through belonging or romantic completion, he becomes something else, something society struggles to categorize. Nietzsche understood this deeply. He saw that society, despite its illusions of progress, is built upon an unspoken contract. We trade our inner freedom for collective security. We accept the rules, the norms, the institutions, including marriage, because they make life predictable. They protect us from chaos, but they also quietly demand our obedience. Michel Foucault, centuries later, would describe this as disciplinary power, not power enforced through violence, but through normalization. We are trained to desire the things that keep us compliant. We internalize the gaze of society so completely that we become our own jailers. And so, the man who doesn't need marriage, who doesn't require social affirmation to feel complete, breaks an invisible rule. He refuses the trade. He represents an alternative mode of being, one where desire is not dictated, where worth is not negotiated. His very existence says you can live without the chains you've mistaken for love. That pass by he is feared, not because he threatens others directly, but because he embodies a freedom most people secretly long for but cannot face. His solitude mirrors their dependency. His silence exposes their noise. His peace makes their restless pursuit of validation suddenly feel hollow. Nietzsche would call this man a forerunner of the Übermensch, not because he's above others, but because he has learned to create values from within rather than borrow them from the herd. He no longer asks, "What do people expect of me?" but rather, "What does life demand of me?" That subtle shift is revolutionary. Yet every revolution, no matter how quiet, threatens the status quo. Society needs people to keep playing their parts: the husband, the wife, the parent, the provider, the consumer. These roles sustain the machine. And so the man who opts out, not through rebellion, but through inner sufficiency, becomes a kind of existential heretic. He shows that life can have meaning without the structures that claim to give it. But this doesn't mean he despises love or connection. On the contrary, his withdrawal from need opens the possibility of choice. He can love without dependency. He can give without demand. He is no longer trapped in the unconscious transaction that defines so much of social and romantic life. This kind of freedom is not loud. It doesn't protest. It simply is. And that's precisely why it's powerful and unsettling. To live as a truly free being, Nietzsche would say, is to become a question mark to others. People will project onto you everything they fear about their own unclaimed power. They'll call you cold, detached, arrogant, when in truth what they're seeing is a reflection of their own captivity. So the quiet rebellion of the self-sufficient man isn't a rejection of society. It's an exposure of its illusions. It's the gentle yet devastating realization that so much of what binds us together is not love, but fear. Fear of being alone, fear of being misunderstood, fear of facing ourselves. And perhaps that's the beginning of wisdom, to recognize that true freedom doesn't need to announce itself. It simply refuses to kneel. There's a quiet tragedy that runs through our romantic ideals, one that's so old, so deeply woven into our language, that we hardly notice it anymore. It's just the idea that love will complete us. From childhood, we're told stories of halves becoming whole: the prince and the princess, the soulmate, the other half. The implication is always the same: you are not enough on your own. Something essential is missing, and only another person can fill it. But that story, though beautiful, carries a hidden wound, because to believe that love completes us is to also believe that we are incomplete without it. This myth has ancient roots. In Plato's Symposium, Aristophanes offers a famous tale. Once humans were round, whole beings, with 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 faces. The gods, fearing their power, split them in 2. Ever since, each half wanders the earth, searching for its missing counterpart. Love, then, is the longing to become whole again. It's a poetic image, but Nietzsche, and later Jung, would challenge it, because if you are waiting for someone else to complete you, then you are building your identity on dependency. You are giving away the creative center of your own life. Carl Jung described the process of individuation, the lifelong journey toward wholeness, not as a merging with another, but as a reconciliation within oneself. We are already divided internally between conscious and unconscious persona and shadow, masculine and feminine. The task is not to find our missing half out there, but to integrate what is missing in here. Yet modern culture, perhaps even more than ancient myth, resists this truth. We are surrounded by messages that reinforce the idea that happiness is relational, that without partnership, something is wrong. Advertisements, movies, and even social rituals all orbit around the central sun. Find someone, and you will be complete. So, what happens when a man or woman quietly steps outside this mythology? When he no longer seeks validation through romance, when he no longer believes his worth depends on being chosen, the world calls him detached. But in truth, he may be discovering something profoundly radical, that love, when freed from the hunger for completion, becomes something purer, not a transaction, but a celebration. Nietzsche wrote, "The greatest happiness is to love one's fate, the more fati, love of one's own destiny. It's a love that begins with self-acceptance, not narcissism, not pride, but the deep recognition that life, even alone, is enough, that one's own existence, with all its contradictions and solitude, is already whole." This doesn't mean withdrawing from intimacy. It means transforming it, because only when love no longer functions as a substitute for identity can it become what it truly is, a free act of giving. Jung would say that genuine connection occurs not between two halves seeking to merge, but between two wholes standing face to face, each rooted in their own center, yet open to the mystery of another. But that level of love is terrifying to society, because if people stopped needing love to feel valuable, the entire emotional economy would collapse. The industries of attention, beauty, romance, and even marriage rely on longing, on lack. The myth of completion keeps the machine turning. So when a man steps outside of it, when he says, "I am already whole," he threatens not just romantic convention, but the cultural fabric that depends on dissatisfaction. His peace is dangerous. His contentment is revolutionary. And yet, the irony is beautiful. Only when we stop needing love do we become capable of truly giving it. Because love is not a cure for emptiness. It is the overflow of fullness. If you've found yourself resonating with this idea, if you've ever felt the quiet strength that comes from standing alone, then you already sense where this path leads. It isn't isolation, it's Stas sovereignty. Subscribe if this resonates. We explore these kinds of questions every week, because every step toward understanding yourself is a step toward freeing the world from its illusions. If there is one force powerful enough to move civilizations, to build empires and break them apart, it's desire. Desire is what drives us to create, to pursue, to love, but it is also what chains us to systems of control. And perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the way society manages our instincts by turning them into obedience. From the beginning, culture has sought to tame what is wild in us. We are born with raw impulses: hunger, lust, curiosity, the need to explore and conquer. Left unchecked, these instincts would make us ungovernable. So from childhood, we are taught to channel them, to desire only what is acceptable, to love only in ways that are recognized, to dream only within the limits of respectability. Sigmund Freud called this the reality principle, the process by which the raw pleasure-seeking part of the psyche, the ID, is constrained by societal rules. Civilization, he argued, depends on repression. It demands that we sublimate instinct into productivity, sexuality into romance, individuality into conformity. And marriage, as an institution, became one of the most effective tools for this domestication. Not because marriage itself is inherently corrupt, but because it neatly packages desire into something stable, predictable, and therefore controllable. It transforms the wild, untamed force of Eros into something that serves the social order. Arthur Schopenhauer saw this too, though in darker terms. For him, desire, especially sexual desire, was nature's trick, a way of ensuring reproduction while disguising itself as love. The individual believes he's pursuing happiness, but he's really serving the species. That's the cruel comedy of nature. You think you've chosen your partner freely, but in reality, life itself has chosen for you. Nietzsche pushed this further. He saw how moral systems, often rooted in religion, transformed the energy of desire into guilt. By labeling instinct as sin, society gained the ultimate form of control, self-censorship. People would no longer need to be policed externally, because they would police themselves internally. And so, the man who refuses this internalized control, who sees through the illusion, becomes dangerous. Not because he's immoral, but because he's amoral in the Nietzschean sense. He lives beyond conventional categories of good and evil. His relationship to desire is no longer one of repression or indulgence, but of mastery. He can acknowledge his instincts without being enslaved by them. Modern psychology echoes this in subtle ways. When a person integrates, rather than suppresses desire, they gain agency. Jung called this shadow work, facing the dark, unaccepted aspects of the self and transforming them into strength. To deny the shadow is to be ruled by it unconsciously. To integrate it is to become whole. Society, however, is built on people who never integrate, people who remain predictable, needy, easily provoked, people who can be sold the illusion of freedom while their desires are quietly directed. The man who no longer needs that illusion cannot be manipulated. He doesn't need validation, approval, or scripted forms of romance. His desire is not for what is permitted, but for what is true. He may appear detached, but he isn't numb. He's lucid. He sees desire not as an enemy to conquer, but as a fire to understand. And that makes him uncontrollable. Nietzsche wrote, "He who cannot command himself must obey." The self-sufficient man commands himself, not through suppression, but through clarity. His mastery isn't cold restraint, it's alignment. His instincts serve his spirit, not his fear. This is why society, even in its most liberal forms, always finds ways to ridicule or pathologize male solitude, chastity, or selective detachment, because it cannot profit from men who are no longer ruled by craving. The independent man's peace is bad for business. His contentment threatens the economy of insecurity. But at a deeper level, his freedom exposes something universal, that what we often call love is just domesticated desire. Desire shaped to fit inside a cage. To see that cage for what it is, and to refuse to live within it, that is the beginning of sovereignty. There's a moment in every person's life when they realize no one is coming to save them. It can arrive quietly, in the aftermath of betrayal, in the silence after love ends, or in the strange emptiness that follows success. In that moment, something profound happens. The illusion of dependency collapses, and what remains is a question, who am I when there is no one left to define me? For Nietzsche, this was the question that marked the birth of the sovereign individual. And on the genealogy of morals, he describes this figure as the human being who has become free, truly free, the one who dares to promise, who owns himself completely. To Nietzsche, most people live reactively. They are products of history, morality, family, and fear. Their desires are inherited. Their beliefs are borrowed. They exist within the echo chamber of cultural conditioning. The sovereign individual, however, breaks this chain. He creates his own values, not in arrogance, but in recognition that life itself has no inherent meaning except the one we give it. He no longer seeks permission to exist. His worth is not contingent upon marriage, status, or moral approval. He becomes, as Nietzsche put it, the poet of his own life. But this kind of freedom is not comfort. It's a crucifixion. Because once you refuse to live by inherited values, you lose the safety of the crowd. You become terrifyingly responsible for yourself. Nietzsche's freedom is not the shallow liberty of doing whatever I want. It's the deeper, heavier freedom of becoming what I must. He writes, "The higher man is distinguished from the lower by his fearlessness in facing what is terrible. To stand alone, to make your own meaning, to love without needing, that's not just independence, that's heroism of the soul." And this is why society fears the sovereign individual. He doesn't fit into any system of control. He cannot be bribed by pleasure or threatened by shame. He cannot be manipulated through loneliness or social pressure. He doesn't need to be rescued, fixed, or entertained. He is whole, and wholeness cannot be governed. Yet Nietzsche is careful to distinguish the sovereign individual from mere rebellion. Rebellion is still a reaction. It defines itself against something. The sovereign individual, by contrast, creates from within. He doesn't need an enemy. He doesn't need recognition. His strength flows from his self-alignment, not his opposition. Think of it like this. Rebellion says, "I refuse your rules." Sovereignty says, "I have no need for rules." This is the man who terrifies society, not the loud critic, but the quiet creator. He lives as if the institutions around him no longer determine his meaning. Marriage, for him, is not an obligation but a possibility, a union chosen freely, not out of fear of solitude. And this distinction changes everything, because when you are no longer compelled by fear of being alone, unloved, misunderstood, you become capable of love without chains. You can enter relationships not as a beggar of affection, but as a giver of strength. In Nietzsche's vision, self-mastery and love are not opposites. They are the same movement of spirit, the transcendence of dependency. The man who can govern his instincts, his emotions, and his purpose is not loveless. He is capable of higher love because his love is voluntary. The sovereign individual embodies what Nietzsche called the innocence of becoming. He knows that life is not a fixed truth to be discovered, but an art to be shaped. His solitude is not loneliness, it's authorship. But this kind of authorship has a cost. It means walking without the safety of certainty. It means bearing the weight of one's own values. It means being willing to face the silence of a world that no longer tells you who you are. And yet, that silence, that terrifying, liberating silence, is where real freedom begins. Because when you no longer depend on anyone to give your life meaning, you finally have the power to give meaning to everything. Every form of freedom comes with a hidden cost. The freer you become from society's expectations, the further you drift from its comforts. It's an unspoken law of human existence. The path toward authenticity always passes through loneliness. Nietzsche knew this intimately. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, his prophet descends from the mountains to share his wisdom with the people and is met with ridicule. His solitude, once a source of strength, becomes a wall between him and the world. The very clarity that sets him free also isolates him. To become independent of external validation is to lose the language of belonging. You stop speaking in terms of should and ought. You stop seeking approval, and in doing so, you stop being understood. People who once admired you now sense something unsettling, a calm that doesn't depend on their praise. And that calm, that silence, can feel like exile. Kierkegaard once called despair the sickness unto death, the moment when a person realizes that they are utterly responsible for who they become. Freedom for him was not joy, but burden. Camus echoed this centuries later in the myth of Sisyphus, writing that the only truly serious philosophical problem is suicide, not in the literal sense, but as a confrontation with the absurd, the recognition that life has no fixed meaning and that we must choose to live anyway. That is the abyss every sovereign individual must face. When all illusions of dependency fall away, when love, approval, and social status no longer define you, what remains? Just you, naked before existence. It is terrifying, and it is sacred. Society hides this truth beneath noise, endless entertainment, distraction, and validation loops, because silence is dangerous. In silence, you begin to see how much of your life was driven by fear of being alone. But the man who doesn't need marriage, or recognition, or even certainty, begins to hear a deeper music beneath that silence, the rhythm of his own being. It's not that he doesn't feel loneliness, he does, but his loneliness matures. It evolves from emptiness into presence, from craving into contemplation. The solitude that once felt like punishment becomes a kind of sanctuary. Camus called this the invincible summer within oneself, the quiet strength that persists even in the depths of winter, because loneliness is not the absence of others, it's the presence of yourself. It's the moment you stop filling the void with noise and finally allow yourself to feel the weight of existence. But there's another price, to misunderstanding. The self-sufficient man is almost always misread. People project onto him arrogance, coldness, emotional unavailability, not realizing that what they're sensing is not detachment, but depth. He does not rush to speak because he listens inwardly. He does not need to prove himself because he's already made peace with who he is. And that kind of peace cannot be understood by those still enslaved by the need to be liked. Nietzsche once said, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." Freedom always shrinks you in the eyes of the crowd. But the higher altitude offers a different kind of view, one where meaning is no longer handed down from society, but drawn up from the soul. To live freely, then, is to accept the loneliness of altitude. It's to understand that the very same independence that isolates you also awakens you. You lose the comfort of conformity, but gain the clarity of vision. The world may not celebrate that kind of freedom. It rarely does. It prefers the predictable comfort of collective illusion. But for those who dare to step beyond it, loneliness is not an end. It's a rite of passage. Because at the edge of that abyss, when you look into the silence long enough, something extraordinary begins to look back, your unbroken self. And from that silence, a new kind of love and life can finally emerge. After all the solitude, the silence, the stripping away of illusions, what remains? If a man no longer needs marriage, validation, or possession, what happens to love? Does he lose it entirely? Or does he finally discover what it truly is? We often mistake need for love. We say, I can't live without you, as if dependency were devotion. We romanticize longing as though the ache itself proves the depth of our affection. But beneath that sentiment lies a hidden contract. I love you because you fill the parts of me I refuse to face. That kind of love, Nietzsche would argue, is not love at all. It's disguised fear. Fear of emptiness, fear of insignificance, fear of meeting oneself in silence. And when fear is the foundation, even the most passionate bond becomes fragile. To love beyond need is to step into a higher form of intimacy, one that Nietzsche hinted at through his idea of amor fati, the love of one's fate. It means saying yes to everything that life brings, the joy, the loss, the solitude, the encounter with another person, without trying to own it or escape it. In amor fati, love ceases to be a transaction and becomes an attitude. It's not about merging, but mirroring, not possession, but participation. Erich Fromm captured this beautifully in The Art of Loving. He wrote that mature love says, I need you because I love you, not I love you because I need you. That reversal changes everything. It means that love flows from inner fullness, not from inner hunger. It's not a desperate reaching outward, but an overflowing inward completeness. The man who no longer needs love becomes paradoxically capable of the most genuine kind, because when you no longer demand that love define or rescue you, it becomes free to reveal you. In this space, relationships are not prisons of expectation, but sacred dialogues between two sovereign souls. Each person stands whole, autonomous, yet open, independent, yet compassionate. There is no grasping, no you complete me, no quiet panic beneath the surface. Only the simple recognition, I see you, not as my possession, not as my savior, but as another expression of life's mystery. This is not an easy love. It requires immense courage. The courage to remain yourself in the presence of another, the courage to not disappear into fusion, the courage to stay free even while connected. Most people unconsciously seek escape through love, escape from their emptiness, their fear of death, their sense of insignificance. But when love is no longer an escape, when it becomes a deliberate encounter between two complete beings, it transforms from desire into devotion. Not devotion to the person, but to the experience of being alive together. In this sense, the man who doesn't need marriage isn't anti-love. He's pro-truth. He sees that dependency isn't intimacy, that possession isn't passion, that what we often call commitment is just fear dressed up as virtue. He seeks not ownership, but honesty. Nietzsche might call him a lover of life rather than a seeker of security, because to love life in its entirety is to stop clinging to permanence. It's to love without demand, without a contract, without the illusion that anything can be kept forever. That's what amor fati really means, to love reality, even when it doesn't love you back, to embrace what comes and let it go when it must, without bitterness, without entitlement. Such love doesn't fit into the structures society builds. It doesn't fuel the industries that depend on longing. It can be commodified, controlled, or measured. And yet, it's the only kind of love that can survive in the face of freedom. Because when two whole people meet, not to complete each other, but to celebrate each other, they create something the world cannot touch. A union without ownership, a bond without bondage. A love born not from need, but from the joy of existence itself. What happens to a man when he no longer needs marriage, approval, or belonging? He doesn't become cold or detached, not if he's truly awake. Instead, he becomes profoundly alive, because for the first time, his love is a choice, not a dependency. Nietzsche once said, "He who cannot command himself will always obey." Most of us obey the hidden voices of culture, family, and fear. We marry because we're told it's time. We love because we're told it's our purpose. We settle because we're told to be grateful for what we get. But the man who confronts his solitude, who passes through the storm of loneliness and arrives at stillness, he no longer obeys those voices. He listens instead to the quiet call of his own soul. Freedom is not the absence of attachment. It's the presence of awareness. It's when you can see your desires clearly without being ruled by them. It's when love becomes an act of strength, not surrender to need, but surrender to truth. This kind of freedom frightens people because it exposes how much of our love has been born from fear, the fear of being alone, the fear of insignificance, the fear of meeting ourselves. But without facing those fears, our relationships remain shallow. We mistake comfort for connection, dependency for devotion. Nietzsche's challenge, and perhaps his gift, was to tell us that the price of real love is freedom, and freedom in turn demands solitude. Only a person who has faced their own emptiness can love without seeking to fill it through someone else. To love differently means to stand in the full light of who you are, not as a beggar of affection, but as a creator of meaning. It means asking not, "Who will complete me?" but "Who can walk beside me while I remain whole?" The truth is, few will understand this path. It's quieter, lonelier, and far less celebrated. There are no ceremonies for those who marry their own soul, no social praise for those who choose solitude over superficial companionship. But there is something sacred that emerges from it, a love that no longer clings, that no longer fears, that no longer begs. It steps the love that looks at life with all its beauty and brutality and says yes. That single word, that radical acceptance, is the highest form of romance, because it means you've stopped bargaining with existence. You've stopped demanding that life give you what you want. You're edged to started loving it for what it is. This is the man Nietzsche envisioned, not the cold cynic, not the isolated hermit, but the Übermensch, the one who loves life enough to affirm it, even when it hurts. He doesn't instead reject love, he refines it. He doesn't avoid commitment, he commits only to what is real. He doesn't instead fear loneliness, he befriends it. And perhaps that sips the true revolution of our time. To learn to love without losing ourselves, to connect without consuming, to commit without controlling, to stand face to face with another person, not out of need, but out of freedom, and to say, "I do not need you to complete me, but I choose to walk beside you, because in your presence I recognize the same courage, the courage to face life as it is. That kind of love may never make headlines. It may never fit neatly into social structures or romantic ideals, but it's the only kind of love strong enough to survive truth. And so, when a man no longer needs marriage, when he no longer seeks validation, ownership, or escape, what he discovers is not the death of love, but its rebirth. A love that is not about possession, but participation, not about forever, but about now. Not about finding home in another, but about becoming at home in oneself, and from that place, sharing warmth freely. Because in the end, to love without need is not to love less. It is to love more purely, more fiercely, more freely, more truthfully. It is to meet life itself as your beloved. And that is the love Nietzsche left us to find